Island Biogeography. Introduction. An island is an area of suitable habitat surrounded by an expanse of unsuitable habitat. While this may be a traditional island, a mass of land surrounded by water, the term may also be applied to many untraditional islands such as the peak of mountains, isolated springs in the desert, or expanses of grassland surrounded by highways or housing tracts. Additionally, an island for one organism may not be an island for another. Some organisms located on mountain tops may also be found in the valleys, while others may be restricted to the peaks. Island biogeography is a field within biogeography that examines the factors that affect the species richness of isolated natural communities. The theory was developed to explain species richness of actual islands. It has since been extended to mountains surrounded by deserts, lakes surrounded by dry land, fragmented forests, and even natural habitats surrounded by human altered landscapes. Now it is used in reference to any ecosystem surrounded by unlike ecosystems. The field was started in the 1960s by the ecologists Robert MacArthur and Ivo Wilson, who coined the term island biogeography, as this theory attempted to predict the number of species that would exist on a newly created island. In this episode, the following 5 modules have been studied. They are historical background of island biogeography, principles of island biogeography, theory of island biogeography, equilibrium theory of island biogeography, endemism. Historical background of island biogeography. The theory can be studied through the fossils which provide a record of life on Earth. 300 million years ago, Europe and North America lay on the equator and were covered by stemmy tropical rainforests. Climate change devastated these tropical rainforests during the Carboniferous period, and as the climate grew drier, rainforests fragmented. Shrunken islands of forest were uninhabitable for amphibians but were well suited to reptiles, which became more diverse and even varied their diet in the rapidly changing environment. This Carboniferous rainforest collapse even triggered an evolutionary burst among reptiles. The importance of islands in revealing evolutionary processes has been recognized since Darwin's work on the Galapagos and Wallace's work in the Malay Archipelago. Since island biogeography has provided many elegant examples of the evolutionary mechanisms involved in generating biodiversity, including geological processes and colonization and isolation. Archipelagos such as Hawaii and the Galapagos provide examples where cycles of evolutionary radiation have produced replicated patterns of endemic, often bizarre forms. The extreme isolation of these islands reduces the interplay between islands and continents interchange in one way and limited to rare chance dispersal events. The West Indies and island chains in the Indian Ocean are remarkable as they are sufficiently old and isolated to have generated endemic forms, but close enough continents to sustain a dynamic two-way interaction with diverse continental land masses. Principle of land biogeography. One basic assumption of island biogeography is that no island will contain the species diversity of the mainland, which served as the source for colonization. This has been supported by numerous studies, most commonly among bird species in California. The reason is to disperse to an island, a species must successfully cross an expanse of water. Water is obviously most limiting to terrestrial species, least limiting to aquatic species, and of very little importance one way or the other to wind dispersed species. Regardless of species type, getting to an island involves traversing distance as well as water. In a critical paper published in 1967, R.H. MacArthur and Ivo Wilson presented the theory of equilibrium for island biogeography. Stated simply, the pair postulated that an island reaches dynamic equilibrium in population size and species diversity through the processes of migration and extinction. New species or members arrive from the source area or the mainland, and existing species become extinct from competition, natural disaster, or genetic inbreeding. In this theory, the adaptation and evolution of species is assumed to progress at rates so slow in comparison to rates of extinction and immigration that it can be safely ignored. Evolution is a significant process only on islands that are large and stable. Otherwise, species simply don't survive long enough to undergo natural adaptation at any one time after equilibrium is achieved. The island will sustain the same number of individuals and species. However, the composition of species will change. The two most important criteria for determining the rate of species change are the area of the island and its distance from the mainland source. Two related but less important factors are connectivity to the mainland and circuitry with other islands. Island area. The concept that small area equals low species diversity is well supported, although the connection is not actually that direct. The true progression may be stated thus: smaller area equals less habitat diversity equals less species diversity. Small populations are more prone to extinction since they are proportionally more affected by problems such as natural disaster, sex or age fluctuations, environmental change, and genetic inbreeding. Therefore, biogeographers generally agree that smaller islands are less capable of supporting high levels of population density and species diversity. Island isolation. The relative isolation of an island from its mainland species source affects the rate of successful immigration. A large island close to the source will sustain more diversity than an identically sized island far from the source simply because more species reach it. Conversely, a large island far from the source may have an immigration rate so low that evolution begins to shape the biota, creating entirely new species. Isolation is also affected by how the island is oriented in relation to prevailing winds, currents, and storms. Connectivity. The degree to which an island is connected to the mainland can mediate the factor of isolation. The two most common connectors for islands are land bridges and stepping stones. Land bridges. For a terrestrial species, travel across an expanse of ocean is a risky endeavor. However, during key moments in Earth history, sea level has dropped sufficiently to form land bridges connecting formerly or currently separate land masses. Land bridges form the most easily transversible terrain for immigration of terrestrial species. Stepping stones. In considering the dispersal of species from the mainland to island, even a layperson can readily distinguish that stepping stone islands exist, providing not quite a land bridge but certainly more of a fighting chance than a solid expanse of ocean. Stepping stones are intermediary between a full land bridge and a solid stretch of ocean. If an island is separated from the mainland by a series of other islands, this will increase the immigration rates of certain species, most notably birds and mammals. Passively dispersed species such as microorganisms and many plants rely more on wind power and therefore do not show a significant change in immigration rates with stepping stones. The effectiveness of a stepping stone is determined by three factors: the size of the stepping stone, the size of the recipient island, and the distance between them. Of these factors, the most important is the distance separating them. For highly visual species such as many predators, the next stepping stone must be within sight to entice a member to make the journey. But for most species, the journey is made by chance or desperation, and distance functions primarily as a determinant of how many members survive to the next patch of the land. As species transverse the series of stepping stones, some species will not survive to the next island. In this way, isolation from the mainland remains a key determinant of immigration despite the advantage of stepping stone as intermediaries. Another consideration is that as the number of alternate stepping stones increases for each recipient island, the flow of species from the source increases. Circuitry. Another important mediating factor on the effects of island size and isolation is the circuitry that exists within an island mainland system. Circuitry refers to the degree to which loops or alternate routes are present within a system. Alternate routes increase the chance that a species will successfully immigrate to an island. For example, if a natural disaster kills an entire bird generation on one island, but a nearby island also supports a population of the species, some members will survive to emigrate to the next island in the system. Theory of island biogeography. Island biogeography has been a subject of considerable interest to biologists and geographers since the time of Darwin, Wallace, and the less well-known Hooker. Hooker explored islands in the South Atlantic and South Pacific. Darwin and Wallace are more important in our current thinking since these two were pioneers in the development of the theory of evolution. However, much of the theory of island biogeography was built on the data which came from their studies of the Galapagos and East Indies respectively. Islands have been studied as natural experiments ever since, with varying levels of intensity. Oceanic islands are isolated and small enough to reveal processes and results too complex to interpret in mainland areas. Islands are unique. Since they are isolated, evolutionary processes work at different rates. There is little or no gene flow to dilute the effects of selection and mutation. Endemism is rampant. However, both in theory and practice, that same isolation makes islands more vulnerable to habitat change and extinction. Introduction of a single predator or herbivore can have dramatic impact on the local community, as we have just seen with biota of the Hawaiian Islands. Islands as natural experiments have not been protected from damage and extinction through human activities. Since islands are isolated and in many cases the species found on them are endemic, extinction has been particularly common on islands. 93% of the bird species whose extinction has been recorded since 1600 have been island species. Historical records suggest a mean extinction rate through the Pleistocene of approximately one species in 83.3 years. In 1980, that rate was one species every 3.6 years. Extrapolating the curve, an extinction rate of one island species per year can be predicted for the immediate future. One of the reasons islands are important in the more general structure of ecology, biogeography, and conservation biology is that islands at least relatively isolate area are excellent natural laboratories to study the relationship between area and species diversity. When we fully understand the relationship, it will be applicable to fragments of habitats that human activities protect. We all know those sanctuaries are important, but we need to know what and how much we can protect in them. The theory of island biogeography proposes that the number of species found on an undisturbed island is determined by immigration and extinction, and further that the isolated populations may follow different evolutionary routes. Immigration and emigration are affected by the distance of an island from a source of colonists. Usually, this source is the mainland, but it can also be other islands. Islands that are more isolated are less likely to receive immigrants than islands that are less isolated. The rate of extinction once a species manages to colonize an island is affected by island size. Larger islands contain larger habitat areas and opportunities for more different varieties of habitat. Larger habitat size reduces the probability of extinction due to chance events. Habitat heterogeneity increases the number of species that will be successful after immigration. Over time, the countervailing forces of extinction and immigration result in an equilibrium level of species richness. The theory of island biogeography is determined by two factors. The first is the effect of distance from the mainland. The mainland is where new immigrant species originally inhabited. The second is the effect of island size. These two factors establish how many species an island can hold at equilibrium. The equilibrium species number is the species richness of an island at which immigration balances extinction and which remains roughly constant. Influencing factors: degree of isolation, length of isolation, size of island, the habitat suitability which includes climate, initial plant and animal composition if previously attached to a larger landmass, the current species composition, location relative to ocean currents, serendipity, human activity. Equilibrium theory of island biogeography. The equilibrium theory of island biogeography proposed by MacArthur and Wilson is a relatively recent development that has sparked a tremendous amount of scientific controversy. The equilibrium theory of island biogeography implies that island fauna and flora eventually reach an equilibrium point between extinction and immigration. Although species rarely reach equilibrium due to the extremely dynamic island system, MacArthur and Wilson note that the equilibrium theory of island biogeography permits general predictions of future island biodiversity patterns. The theory of island biogeography is examined in reference to island environments including topographic origins and characteristics as well as climatic patterns. A comprehensive analysis regarding species-area relationship, dispersal mechanisms and their response to isolation, and species turnover played an important role. Additionally, conservation of oceanic and continental islands is examined in relation to minimum viable populations and areas, metapopulation dynamics, and continental reserve design. Finally, adverse anthropogenic impacts on island ecosystems are investigated, including overexploitation of resources, habitat destruction, and introduction of exotic species and diseases. The objective of this is to study classical and emergent theories which may be brought into the study of island biogeography and its relevance to mainland ecosystem patterns. The equilibrium theory of island biogeography describes the theoretical relationship between immigration and extinction of species to islands depending on their size and distance from the mainland or other species source. Consider the degree of isolation of the area under study. Isolate. Oceanic islands are usually created by volcanic activity. Continental islands are formed when the water level rises. How do species access these islands over time? On oceanic islands, the number of species present increases over time until it reaches the level of the nearest mainland. On continental islands, the number of species present decreases over time. Species richness relaxes to a new equilibrium depending on the degree of isolation and the size of the island. According to equilibrium theory of island biogeography, the number of species present on an island is determined by a balance between immigration and extinction. Generally, as the number of species present increases, the immigration rate decreases and the extinction rate increases. There are two general relationships to remember. Immigration is higher on near islands than on distant islands. Hence, the equilibrium number of species present will be greater on near islands. Extinction is higher on smaller islands than on larger islands. Hence, the equilibrium number of species present will be greater on large islands. Therefore, the number of species on near large islands is greater than the number of species on distant small islands. Island biogeography has become an essential component of conservation biology, particularly in the analysis of preserve design. Endemism. Endemism comes from the word endemic, which means it is unique to its own place or region and not found naturally anywhere else. The place must be a discrete geographical unit, often an island or island group, but sometimes a country, habitat type or other defined area or zone. Endemic regions often include large bodies of water or mountain ranges, but mostly islands due to their isolation. Older islands usually have a higher degree of endemism. Endemic species can often become endangered or extinct due to their limited habitats and vulnerability to the actions of humans, such as large-scale logging and slash and burn techniques. Some ecosystems with high endemism include the Hawaiian forests, the fynbos in South Africa, and many other rainforests and dry forests. The physical, climatic and biological factors can contribute to endemism. The orange-breasted sunbird is exclusively found in the fynbos vegetation zone of southwestern South Africa. The glacier bear is found only in limited place in southeast Alaska. Political factors can play a part if a species is protected or actively hunted in one jurisdiction but not another. Endemic species are also affected greatly by invasive or alien species. Such is the case for the Hawaiian tree snail. The Hawaiian tree snail's existence is being threatened by the loss of habitat via deforestation and by the grazing of ungulates, predation by rats, and an intentionally introduced snail, Euglandia rosea. Conclusion. The MacArthur and Wilson's dynamic equilibrium theory has had revolutionary impact on island biogeography in particular and on biogeography in general by providing a conceptual framework and insight into the dynamics of geographical patterns of species diversity. It has been one of the more influential concepts in biogeography, ecology, and evolutionary biology. However, several aspects of the equilibrium theory remain unsubstantiated, and while it appears to hold in some specific cases, it does not in many others. Concepts and research of island biogeographic theory have had a significant impact on the planning and management of nature reserves. Strong links exist between islands and reserves in terms of area, isolation, connectivity, and circuitry. Except in special cases, conservation biologists now recommend that reserves be composed of a single large area. When this is not feasible, several small patches can be substituted, but care must be taken to provide high degrees of connectivity and circuitry. Connections either by corridors or stepping stones must be planned based on the dispersal mechanisms of target species. In all cases, the matrix surrounding the reserve should be managed to minimize contrast, such as the use of buffer zones. Thank you.